How's it going, everyone? I hope you're having a good day. Today we have a podcast with Will Demakis. He's a history teacher. He's also a track coach. We get into talking about the history of the 1900s, kind of looking around World War One, World War Two, and how that relates to the war in Ukraine today. And it's kind of interesting because, like, you see history repeating itself in a few different ways. And yeah, I hope you like it. Along with some other news, we are releasing now on Spotify, also along with YouTube. So if you want to check out Let's Talk with JMO on Spotify, it'd be very much appreciated. But other than that, I hope you enjoy the episode and I hope you have a good day. Take care. How's it going, everyone? We got Will Demakis here. He is a history teacher and a track coach from Virginia. He's a good friend of mine. How you been, Will? What have you been up to?
Well, thanks for having me, Jimmy. A lot of interesting stuff going on lately. Just got back 2 days ago from the Nike Outdoor National Meet in Eugene, Oregon. One of the kids that I coach wound up winning national championship there in the 200-meter dash, so that was pretty exciting. School year just wrapped up, so I'm enjoying my first couple days of summer break and looking forward to having this conversation.
Yeah, I've been very excited to have you on. We've been talking about this for a very long time.
Yes, we have. Glad it finally came together.
Me too. So, for everyone, you're a history teacher, and like, what kind of got you into history? Like, you have like a background, like a time where like, oh, I know I want to do this, or was it like kind of just a gradual thing?
I've always kind of had an interest in history, like as far as I can remember. Yeah, I can't really trace it back to any particular point, but I do recall like a parent-teacher conference from when I was in kindergarten with with my kindergarten teacher, like sitting down telling my parents that he really has an interest in history and social studies, and that has held true ever since. So,
Wow,
um,
that's a
yeah,
long
a,
time
a
ago.
lot, considerable amount of time, I would say.
Yeah. Um, and so like, what kind of piques your interest in history? Is it like, do you do geopolitical stuff, or is it like history of wars, or?
Yeah, so I kind of have a broad-ranging interest, but the thing that I mostly kind of am fascinated by is military history, and then the stuff that kind of feeds into that, like geopolitical history, political science, geography, stuff like that, ethnographic studies that like all lead up into the conflicts that tend to break out into military um, confrontations. I have an interest in that stuff as well, but it all basically trickles down from a longstanding fascination with military affairs, military history.
Okay, cool. So, do you want to kind of break down how these outlying things kind of lead to wars? Because like, I think a lot of people kind of overlook that. Because I mean, there's been many wars through history, so it's like a lot of people don't even know what caused the beginning of World War Two. And I know you're big into World War Two.
Right. Well, so there's not really any one simple point to it and pick it out of a lineup type cause for any given military conflict. World War II and this current issue between Ukraine and Russia are no exceptions to that. Most history books, most history classes will point to the start of World War II being September 1st, 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded what was at that point the independent country of Poland. As a result of the war, Poland loses its independence, doesn't get it back until after the fall of the Soviet Union and, well, the Iron Curtain, really, in 1989. Anyways, going off on a tangent there. So most, like when you take history in high school or middle school, whenever you start going over World War II, that's usually the date that people use, like September 1st, 1939, World War II,
Is
because that is when it starts. And the precipitating event is the German invasion of Polish borders. But that's not the only cause of World War II, because it doesn't make sense for Britain and France and Russia and China and the United States and Japan to all start killing each other because Germany invaded Poland. There's more stuff at play there, and the invasion of Poland was kind of just the point of eruption where a bunch of those other issues boiled over.
Okay, and
So
so that's kind of, I think that outlines a lot, because like a lot of people just think it's that Independent Day, and I mean, yes, people know there's stuff that leads up to it and like align things, but it kind of goes to show that like there's a lot going on nowadays, especially with like Ukraine and Russia conflict. That has been led up for 8-9 years, if not longer.
yeah, well, and that's a great example of the point I was trying to make, because the conflict between Russia and Ukraine has really kind of been simmering since about 2014, when, depending on how you want to look at it, Russia either invaded parts of Ukraine at the time, or there was a spontaneous uprising by Russian ethnic minorities in certain parts of Ukraine that declared their independence from Ukraine, and that Russia wound up supporting. That's somewhat open to interpretation, but the fact of the matter is, big chunks of eastern Ukraine, as well as the Crimean Peninsula, have been in a state of armed conflict with the Ukraine polity itself since 2014. And in particular, with the seizure of Ukraine, of the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine, that was basically a soft invasion by Russia. Ukraine accepted it and acknowledged it right away. There was very little bloodshed there, mostly because the strategic positioning for Ukraine with tackling that, they just in 2014 were not in a situation where they could resist a full-on Russian invasion, and provoking further armed conflict with Russia at that point would have led to a huge disaster for Ukraine, much greater than what's currently going on, because I think one thing that's pretty much astonished everybody is just how well Ukraine's fighting right now. But they really cut their teeth in that regard going back in 2014, because Donetsk and Luhansk, those regions of eastern Ukraine that were effectively seized by Russia, they've been fighting there pretty much ever since. And it reached its peak in like 2014-15, kind of simmered down into what is really more like a frontier border type dispute. But of the last 9 years, yeah, several thousand people have been killed fighting in that area. And then the full-on invasion of Ukraine that broke out in February kind of really upped the ante. But it goes back even further beyond that, because you can kind of trace a lot of the issues between Russia and Ukraine to a bunch of very complex relationships between the countries and also the peoples that lived there, going back the last couple hundred years through European history, like before the Soviet Union, back through the early days of the Tsarist regime.
And the whole civil war that happened. It's funny, I'm actually reading, I don't know if you've heard of it before, but the Gulag Archipelago.
Oh yeah, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. It's pretty dense but very fascinating read.
Yeah, I'm not very far into it yet, but I'm probably about a fourth of the way through, and it kind of, I find it very interesting because it's outlining these issues that actually kind of go back to what you're talking about, the hundreds of years, because there was what a lot of people don't know, because a lot of people don't read this far into history and all that. But in Russia, and even the 1919 and before, they were just arresting people that they didn't agree with. And like they called it in the book, I don't really know how to pronounce the author's name, but it's Solzhenitsyn or something like that. He refers to them as waves of arrests, where what's known as the old KGB, but it was known as something else way back when, would go and just arrest multiple people from just towns. You wouldn't even have to have done anything. They would arrest you, and you'd ask for what, and they would never respond to you, and you'd never get an answer, and you'd be either in exile or in a gulag, which is a Russian prison, pretty much a concentration camp at that end. Just work, but not completely just killing people like concentration camps were. So like these issues do go back a very long way. And when the USSR collapsed in 91, right? That's when it
1991, yeah.
Yeah, when it collapsed in 91 and these countries all had their freedom from this what would you call it? Almost a tyranny or a it was almost like their countries held hostage.
Yeah. So the Soviet Union was basically a collectivized form of the old Tsarist empire. During their October Revolution in 1917, they got rid of the Tsarist regime that kickstarted a brutal civil war in Russia that really didn't kind of wrap up until 1922. It was functionally over by 1919, but the fighting didn't really end until 1922, so it lasted about 5 years. And when the Soviet government replaced the Tsarist regime and took over and consolidated its control over Russia, Tsarist Russia, that included a lot of countries that are no longer part of Russian territorial sovereignty. And that happens to also include Ukraine, but also a bunch of other states like Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, Moldova, Georgia, just a whole bunch of them, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, like all that stuff in that area that's basically not China was the Russian Empire. Well, if it wasn't China or the British Empire, it was the Russian Empire up until the collapse of the Tsarist Empire in 1917. And then the Soviet Union took all that over and administered it until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And the Soviet Union was largely dominated by ethnic Russian political figureheads. Not entirely. The most notorious Russian leader was Joseph Stalin, who was actually a Georgian, but a lot of his deputies were ethnically Russian. His immediate successor, Nikita Khrushchev, ethnically Russian. The last premier of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, ethnically Russian. And so even though the Soviet Union was supposed to be it's a communist regime and theoretically was in adherence to the principles of Karl Marx. So it was supposed to be like ruled by the proletariat and everything was administered by the people. It was largely Russian Marxist political philosophers that were kind of controlling everything. And even though it was nominally a people's republic, it was really only controlled by a handful of people, not the people, but a couple of individuals. And much like you were pointing out with dialogue about Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, the Soviet Union used secret police and secret prison facilities, the gulags, to basically control dissent and weed it out from the population. That was a holdover from the Tsarist regime. When the when the Tsar was overthrown, their secret police was basically rendered defunct, but a lot of those former operatives immediately went into service for the Bolshevik government, forming a secret police agency known as the Cheka. That eventually evolved into the NKVD, which eventually became the KGB, which is now known as the FSB.
Yep.
And that's like the current internal and external security organization of the current Russian state.
Okay. Well, why don't we wrap some things just to explain to people that don't know some of these terms. So you said the philosophy behind the Russian government between 1919 and 1991 was supposed to be communist, ruled by the what was the word?
Proletariat is a term that was created mostly by the philosopher who created the idea of communism, Karl Marx, and his partner Friedrich Engels. Basically, proletariat is just it's a term that refers to the working class, people that don't own any of the means of production and are generally taken advantage of by, to use kind of the ideas of Marx, by the capitalist and the industrialist to produce the materials that they profit from.
Mm-hmm.
But the proletariat do not share in the profits, at least according to a Marxist interpretation of capitalistic society.
Okay.
So the proletariat is specifically referred, it's basically just a fancier way of saying the people,
Mm-hmm.
but it has a specific connotation that the proletariat refers to working class folk who have largely been ignored and marginalized by the ruling powers and institutions. But without them, those ruling powers and institutions cannot exist.
Right. And so with that kind of covered, there was almost like the Gulag Archipelago is a book by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Yeah, I can't pronounce his last name. It's very
have no idea
difficult.
if I'm pronouncing it either. I just like try.
Yeah, it's a different language as last name. So it's like very hard to pronounce. But beside the point, the reason it's so important is because it's kind of pointing out what that book did was he wrote it when he was in the gulags.
Yep.
Who said this? I can't think of his name right now. But he's a speaker now. He's from Canada. I can't think of his name. But he refers to him and tells a story about him, about how he wrote the Gulag Archipelago, and it, in turn, it's where the saying where one man that stops lying can bring down a tyranny.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about how the Gulag Archipelago was written because Solzhenitsyn thought that he couldn't figure out why he was in prison, what he had done wrong to end up having his life destroyed like this. And so he thought, rather than say, oh, why me? I might as well go through my life with a fine-tooth comb and figure out every decision I've made along the way that put me here.
Mm-hmm.
And so he did. He meditated on this for a very long time. It brought him to this point where he took full responsibility, even though he had the perfect people to blame. I mean, he fought in World War II, and then he was thrown in the gulag when he came back. But instead of blaming other people for where he was in life, he took full accountability for it. And so he tried to amend the things he had done wrong in his life, and that was through telling the truth and the actual history, of the Soviet Union. And the fall of the Soviet Union had to do with they were lying to each other constantly, just lies on top of lies. And if you build everything on lies instead of the truth, it crumbles. So, long story short, him writing the Gulag Archipelago led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union because people everywhere read it in the Soviet Union. And it led to the fall of this. It was one of the reasons for the fall of the Soviet Union. And the reason I bring up this and why we're talking about history is we don't want it to repeat. And I think that kind of goes to show that, hey, there's this thing going on in Ukraine, but it's way bigger than just Ukraine itself. We care about the sovereignty of Ukraine, don't get me wrong. But if we allow the Soviet Union to, in essence, become rebuilt, we're in a dangerous situation because you can see just by watching the Russian media right now, they're just lying. They're going on this whole tangent of they're chasing Nazis.
Right. When the president and vice president of Ukraine, president and the prime minister of Ukraine are both 100% Jewish, which kind of a non-starter for being a Nazi.
Yeah, exactly. So we just get to this very interesting point why history is so important to learn about. And I mean, hats off to you for finding it so interesting. I find it interesting too, but I never really got so deep into studying it. So we have to look to people like you to teach us more about it. And that's why I kind of want to dive into the whole, why don't we dive into like World War II and its importance and how it's kind of similar to how the invasion of Ukraine has happened.
Yeah. Well, probably the best launching point for that is to go back to one of the first questions you asked me, which is, how did World War II start? And I said, I'm like, well, the invasion of Poland, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff that led up to it. There are a lot of, also touching on the not wanting history to repeat itself, there are a lot of like rhyming parallels between the outbreak of the Second World War in Poland, and specifically between the Nazi regime and the Polish government, and the current conflict unfolding itself in Ukraine between that government and Russia. So I'll try to keep myself from going off on like too deep of a tangent here.
Oh, you're good.
But so one of the chief additional causes of World War II, not beyond the invasion of Poland, was this desire by the German Nazi government to expand its territory and seize more land for its population, because the German government believed, and I'm going to use German and Nazi interchangeably here, even though that's not strictly speaking entirely appropriate. But at the outbreak of war in 1939, all government officials were functionally, for the most part, were Nazis. By 1941, you couldn't be a government official unless you were a Nazi. So hence why I'm using them interchangeably. Anywho, that was a sidebar. This desire for expansion was a huge motivating factor. But to understand it, and again, I'll explain in a moment here how it parallels with the current state of affairs with Russia. To understand why the Nazis, why the Germans had this desire to expand, you have to look at the ethnic makeup of Europe in 1939, because it's changed significantly post 1945 because of the end of the war. Germany, as we understand it as a country, used to be a lot larger than it currently is now. And it used to be even larger than that prior to 1939. But after Germany lost the First World War, the German Empire was broken up. Their leader, the Emperor or Kaiser, went into exile. Germany was cut into a bunch of different little pieces to try to destroy its war-making capacity, which had really kept Europe in a constant state of crisis going back to the formation of the German Empire itself as a result of bloody war in France in 1870. And World War I was a massive catastrophe, killed 30 million people, and the world had never really seen any kind of bloodletting quite like that. So it was very deeply traumatizing. The victorious powers were like, we got to put an end to Germany stuff. And they cut a bunch of German territory off. Specifically, when Poland got its independence, a big chunk of what had traditionally been the heart of Germany, the region of Prussia, was given to the Poles in order to give Poland access to the Baltic Sea. This became known as the Polish Corridor, and at the tip of it was the largely ethnically German city of Danzig, which was made into a free city, basically its own independent little country that was deeply sympathetic to Germany and Germans, but was largely administered by Poles. And that was a huge point of contention. But that also split a chunk of Eastern Prussia off from Germany, but it was still considered to be German. So if you look at a map from 1939, you'll see like you have Germany over here, then you've got Poland, and then you have a little bit more of Germany off in the east. Geographically,
Quick question with that. So would that be an enclave of Germany, or was it?
No, I was just about to touch on that and say that geographically there are parallels currently, because there's this enclave of Russia called Kaliningrad, which is basically in modern day Lithuania, surrounded by it. But an enclave is basically like a small chunk of territory. Eastern Prussia, as it was known post World War I, pre-World War II, that would be like a better example would be, say, like Michigan,
Oh,
because
okay.
the state of Michigan is split into two pieces,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not like the upper part of Michigan is not considered to be an enclave of Michigan itself. It's considered part of the state. Same thing with Eastern Prussia. It's a massive area, part of Germany. It's just split by the 60-mile wide corridor for Poland to have access to the Baltic Sea from the rest of Germany. So that's like the geographic setup. Oh, crap, we're running out of time here.
That's okay. We'll just restart the meeting when it time's out.
Fair enough. So that's the geographic setup. But beyond that, the ethnic makeup of Europe was incredibly complex. Post 1945, it's still pretty complex, but it gets really simplified because going deep into Russia, like at that time, Soviet Russian territory, for hundreds of years, there was a massive population of ethnic Germans who spoke German. And a big chunk of the distrust between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, which eventually results in them breaking out in military conflict, stems from the fact that not that they're just that they're political opposites, but also that a good chunk of like the secret police and the officers corps of the Tsarist regime that the Soviets overthrew came from ethnic Germans. Like if you look at the makeup of the Russian Imperial General Staff at the outbreak of World War I and a bunch of their big field commanders, you'll notice a lot of them have supremely German names. Mm-hmm. So there was this big distrust that, oh, well, the Germans were a big chunk of the Tsarist repressive instrument. We overthrew that. We can't trust them. And there were millions of ethnic Germans living in former Tsarist lands, including Russia at the outbreak of the Nazi invasion in June 22nd, 1941. There were millions of Germans ethnic Germans living in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, Ukraine. And part of what caused the outbreak of World War II was this idea going back to the 1800s that the German people that speak German and have that shared cultural and linguistic background deserve and must be united under one overarching power, that power being Germany, the guarantor of German ethnic protection. And the fact that there were tens of millions of Germans living outside of Germany, many of whom had previously been living in Germany up until 1919, created this big movement in Germany post-World War I to try to bring them back into the fold and basically recapture the pride and strength that Germany had before the outbreak of the war. Nazi Party was the most successful political group at weaponizing that sentiment and getting followers to support them. It took them some time to do that. It wasn't like a right off the bat thing. But by 1933, they'd accumulated enough. They came to power. And they were able to browbeat into submission all other political groups in Germany by basically weaponizing and taking over the police, and military and legal structure of the German state and turning it from a democratic society into a functional dictatorship. Then a few years later, they turned it into an actual dictatorship. And then the Second World War broke out. Anyways, one off on tangent there. The way that parallels with Russia today is that one of Putin's stated aims for the war is that he's trying to protect Russian ethnic minorities that are being exterminated in Ukraine. That's his whole argument for this special military operation that he launched. Most of those Russian minorities happen to live in Donetsk and Luhansk, the separatist regions that have been in a state of conflict since 2014, but there's a lot of them that also live across Ukraine. On the flip side of that, there are also a lot of Ukrainians that live in Russia. Mm-hmm. There's also massive ethnic Russian populations in the Baltic states like NATO, like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, which are NATO aligned. And those states in particular have concern, especially looking at Ukraine and the Russian invasion there, that Russia might use that as a pretext for land grabs in those areas as well, which is part of the reason why they wanted NATO protection. They got it. I knew, again, going off on a tangent. So the way the Nazi determination to protect ethnic Germans in the East led to the outbreak of World War II is they wanted to expand into those territories and take that land back, and also gain land that had never really been a part of Germany, like the ethnic German occupied lands in traditional Russia that had never been part of the German Empire before. They wanted to seize those as well, and basically install the ethnic German population as dominant landlord. It's kind of a retroactive throwback to the Order of Teutonic Knights from the medieval ages when they had massive, what's the term? Not plantations, estates that the Germans dominated, and they forced the other non-German minority groups, like largely the Slavs that lived in those areas, to work for them, functionally as slave labor. They did that again during World War II. The Russians, for centuries, have viewed themselves as being the protectors of the Slavic peoples. That partly is what led to the outbreak of World War I, which in turn led to World War II. And the Slavic peoples, that's a wide umbrella. That includes Serbs, Bosnians, Czechs, Poles, well, sort of Poles, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Russians, Ukrainians. And the Russian argument that, oh, we have to protect our Slav brothers has been used many times, especially in the last century, to justify Russian military interventions. They most recently, like before this, the dissolution of the Yugoslavian Republic in the late 80s, early 90s, and that subsequent like series of ethnic cleansings, genocide, civil war in that part of the country. The NATO and UN sent peacekeepers there, but so did the Russians. And those groups didn't always see eye to eye. The Russians sent their peacekeepers in, oftentimes at a mission at odds with the NATO/UN forces, was to protect ethnic Russians living in those areas, as well as their Slavic brothers, generally the Serbians, and support them in their attempt at statehood.
So was it pretty much a proxy war at that point?
Not really, because in the Balkans, like the peacekeeping groups weren't really fighting each other, but like the UN, NATO, they were trying to ensure that certain parts of the former Yugoslavia that were trying to gain statehood and also were facing a threat of mass bloodshed by other rival ethnic groups didn't do that. The Russians were largely trying to support the emergence of a strong, powerful Serbia out of that block of countries that formed. And the UN and NATO didn't necessarily want that to happen because a big chunk of the ethnic cleansings that were conducted during that time were coming from the Serbians, who had most of the Yugoslavian army and military equipment locked up at their behest. And so like in 1999, NATO carried out a bombing campaign against Serbia and their ally, the Republic of Srpska. But that's not germane to the whole like Ukraine. Russia.
Yeah.
Went off on a tangent there.
That's okay. I'm going to hold you there for a second.
Sure.
Let's get this meeting restarted real quick. We'll be right back with you guys. We're back. We got the meeting started. And I think we're at the part where you were talking about how Russia was using the idea of protecting Russian-speaking people as a... we dive into a little bit of the history about that and the conflict where we sent or the U.S. sent peacekeepers and the UN did to, I forget which country it was in particular.
Bosnia, Kosovo, former Yugoslavia in the 90s.
Okay. So, let's go from there. So, you're running off of that.
So, what I was saying before was that this parallels the one of the main causes of the Second World War, which was a Nazi desire to unify ethnic Germans around Europe with the German polity itself.
Mm-hmm.
And the Germans started doing that by more or less peaceful territorial acquisitions, but they threatened use military force if they didn't get their way. And they were, the whole reason they were doing this, their plan was like to protect ethnic Germans abroad and to take territory that had previously belonged to Germany and make it German again. With Russia, going back a couple hundred years, they have a history of using a pretext of protecting their Slavic brothers as a pretext for territorial expansion and military confrontations. First World War One largely broke out because of the Austro-Hungarian. Well, it broke out for a number of reasons, but the stuff that led it to actually begin was a Serbian college kid shot an Austrian political figurehead. The Austrians wanted Serbia to pay. Serbia did everything that they realistically could have done to pay back, but the Austrians made demands that they just simply could not meet. And ultimately, the Austria invaded Serbia. Serbians are Slavs. So when Austria invaded, Russia demanded that they would go to war with with Austria, unless Austria left Serbia alone within 2 weeks. Austria didn't do that. Russia declared war to protect their Slavic brothers, and then just spiraled from there. And 30 million people died.
Jesus.
But they've used that many times, not just for military conflict, but also as an exercise of Russian power around the world, mostly across Europe. And that's largely what is going on right now in Ukraine. The whole casus belli that Putin announced when he began his invasion, which the Russians refer to as a special military operation, was to protect ethnic Russians living in Ukraine. And he, in a speech a couple of weeks ago, kind of indicated that there's more to it than just that. But the primary reason for the war, in the speech that he delivered to some students, was that he's really more trying to reclaim land that formerly belonged to Russia. Putin has mentioned a couple times that he does not believe Ukraine legally exists, that it's a fake country.
I believe he wrote a whole paper on it, or what would you call it? Not just a paper, but like not a book, but like a memoir or something on how he doesn't believe that it is a sovereign nation.
Mm-hmm. I guess the term for that might be manifesto.
Yeah.
Something that's like longer than an essay, but shorter than a book, like more limited focus than a book.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like a couple of his chief advisors argue that the Russian Empire, then Soviet Union, shouldn't have broken up, and that it is Russia's right and duty to reform that sort of political entity. No, political is the wrong word. Geopolitical entity, and bring that power back, because Russia, much like the United States, has this massive ego and this idea that they are a great country and they deserve to have the prestige and power and strength that goes with their natural state of greatness. And that is a national mindset that's very similar to what was prevalent in Germany post World War One. Before World War One too, but they lost the war and then had to suffer this massive national humiliation.
Mm-hmm.
Much like the Russians have had to suffer the massive national humiliation of being the dominant power group in two empires that in turn failed. The Tsarist regime that was overthrown by the Soviets, the Soviet regime that collapsed of its own accord in 1991. And they've been dealing with that ever since.
Yeah.
That in Russia they have a massive population that is largely older, and the majority of Russians are old enough to remember the Soviet Union, or at least old enough to remember how bad things were after it fell and how good they were when it existed in that rose-colored rose-colored glasses of nostalgia that
I was
3-year-olds
gonna say,
have stuff that existed when they were young.
yeah, because it's almost like, and I didn't live in Russia. I don't know this, but from reading what I've read of the Gulag Archipelago, and I think that's an important book to read, even though it's long and dense and hard to understand at points.
Well, it's Russian literature. That's basically
Yeah,
what it is. Long, dense, tough to understand, and when you do, incredibly depressing. And
yeah. I mean, I think that's a very good point too. It's just like, but it kind of puts you in this, not to be like, oh, America's great and all this, because I mean, we have plenty of things we're doing wrong. That,
yeah, that's not the
yeah,
diatribe we're trying to go down. Is just trying to draw a parallel between how like we view ourselves, but also how the Russians view themselves too. And that's
mm-hmm,
part of the reason why we butt heads all the time.
exactly. I mean, you could draw parallels to Soviet Russia in some of the ways that I won't go into it, but you could draw some parallels if you
For sure.
read up and then do your studies on certain other countries. Um, but that being said, I think it's important to kind of mention that Ukraine wasn't in a great, like, before I go off on that tangent, I'm going to finish what I was saying before about the Gulag Archipelago. I think it's important that's an important book to read as anyone across the world, especially people in America, actually, that this is how life could be if we let things get out of hand. And I say that in the sense of we have a lot of things going on right now in America that put us in a point where we're letting this almost, I don't want to say mob mentality, but like we're getting pulled apart by this idea that we're so different from each other. And if we let it get to a certain point, we could lose a lot of the things that we hold dear in terms of our freedoms or how we treat each other in positive ways. And it goes back to what I lie on a lot in these podcasts, is just humanizing each other and being honest with each other, and just that's, I think, what the Gulag Archipelago is about, is being honest and not letting someone split you up from others and dehumanize others.
Right.
That's largely what I've taken from it so far, is if we build something off lies, it'll never stand alone on its own.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, what they played off of in 2014 when they were annexing Crimea was there's a huge, I think you'd probably be able to explain this better than I, but I remember this. The government of Ukraine was in a very bad place financially, and the people had a very negative look on their government back in 2014. This was before the current president was president. Zelensky got put into presidency, I think, after giant protests and riots happened in Ukraine, which it kind of led to Crimea and the Donetsk region being almost not annexed, but seceding, or however you want to view it, whatever ended up actually happening. I'm not sure in entirety how to phrase it.
Yeah. So the long and short of what you were just describing is basically, so quick history lesson on Ukrainian independence post-Soviet era. They got their independence in 1991. Soviet Union collapsed, and like all those constitutional republics of the, and I don't mean constitutional in the sense of like the U.S. Constitution or anything like that. I mean constitutional as in they are component pieces. I guess I should have used component instead. Because the thing that we have to understand about the Soviet Union is, even though we view it as a dictatorship because it's always dominated by one guy at the top, the premier, it on the surface tried to be a legitimate Marxist, like legitimately in line with Marxist philosophy, where the people, the proletariat, chose their leaders, and the Soviet Union was split into different provinces, different republics, based on people that were living there, and they would choose their representatives to the Soviet parliament, which somewhat confusingly is referred to as the Soviet. But they also didn't really get the choice of. There were elections in the Soviet Union. If you want to know more about it, there's like a 3-minute video on YouTube called History Matters, or their elections in the Soviet Union, that briefly and succinctly explains it. But functionally, the way it worked is like you got the one choice, but you also didn't have to vote for them. And so if you didn't vote for the person from your area that was supposed to represent you in the Soviet, and nobody voted for them, which did happen a few times, then that informed the Soviet government that that individual had lost the faith of the proletariat, and that individual would go away to a gulag. Or if we're talking Stalin times,
Yeah.
to a NKVD cell, and then get what was referred to somewhat sardonically by the NKVD as a 9-gram pension for the weight of the bullet that they would deposit into the back of the head.
Jesus.
So like that. Anyways, went off on a tangent. The point I was trying to make is that the Soviet Union was comprised of a bunch. It was a union comprised of a bunch of different countries that the Soviet government recognized as, to an extent, being independent as long as they did exactly what the Soviet regime wanted them to do. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, all those little republics that constituted the Soviet Union became their own countries. A bunch of them very quickly decided that, you know what, being our own country kind of sucks. We're going to just stick with Russia, since they're the largest and most powerful of these groups, and we're going to be a part of them. That's why Russia has, to this day, is called the Russian Republic.
Republic of Russia.
Yeah, and like, for instance, guy with a big beard. Syria fought a war against Russia. I'm drawing a blank on it. In the 90s and 2000s, Kadyrov. His name is Kadyrov. God, what is that? Why can I not remember the name of Chechnya?
Yeah.
Chechnya is a semi-independent part of Russia. It's a republic within the Russian. I'm sorry, the proper name of Russia is the Russian Federation, not republic. Federation, because each of the parts of Russia have a limited degree of autonomy. Chechnya and Dagestan have kind of like the largest amount of autonomy. But I digress. Ukraine, it was a component of the Soviet Union that had a massive population, and also had a large ethnic difference from like Russia itself, to which it is very closely bordered. But the Russian and Ukrainian languages and cultures are very, very close. And to this day, like, the vast majority of Ukrainians also speak Russian. President Zelensky, his primary language is not Ukrainian, it's Russian. And so he speaks both Ukrainian and Russian very fluently, as does most of the Ukrainian leadership. And they're very, very closely linked. I'm going to stop myself from going off on another tangent and focus just on the post-1991 history of Ukraine. So Ukraine struggled with getting its feet under itself as a country. Up until about 2000, it was pretty much dominated by former Soviet officials who were in power. And around 2000, they had their first elections, and they brought in some new people. But they were also trying to establish their own independent national identity. But they were very closely tied with Russia. And Russia had a vested interest in maintaining a reliable client in Ukraine. And I'll come back to that in a little bit, about why Russia is invading Ukraine now, and like the differences and the similarities between them, and how that's kind of fueled this conflict, but also part of the reason why like no one really, other than U.S. intelligence, saw it coming up until Russian tanks rolled across the border. But so as we start getting in the mid-2000s, Ukrainian people, for the most part, their leaders have been former Soviet officials and were very closely aligned to the modern Russian Federation, kind of moving more or less in lockstep with them. They want to be independent, but they also realize that, like, hey, Russia's a big power. they still have a lot of pull in this area, and they're right on our doorstep. So like we don't want to piss them off. But after 2004, Ukrainian government started kind of moving away from Russia, not in an unfriendly manner, but they started trying to exercise actual democratic institutions. Russia didn't really care for that, so they kind of started interfering in Ukrainian politics, and it reached a head after 2010. Uh, Ukraine was also in dire financial straits. They've been struggling with it, as most of Eastern Europe had since the fall of communism, and still is. Um, and they wound up having a guy in power named Viktor Yanukovych. He was the president, and he was a Putin puppet, still is. Um, and he started pushing back against the Ukrainian people and their increasing frustration with what appeared to be, rigged elections largely in Russian favor. Because around 2010, a lot of Ukrainians started really feeling like their political inclinations were not being reflected by the people that were being elected. But Ukraine also allowed just enough freedom of the press that people were aware that like there were more non-pro-Russian voters than there were pro-Russian voters, but yet only pro-Russian people kept getting voted into office. This boiled up into what became known as the Orange Revolution. Yanukovych was chased from power, but after using like it looked like Ukraine was on the verge of civil war in 2013. Yanukovych left and fled to Russia, and a new guy came in, Petro Poroshenko, to basically replaced him non-democratically because Yanukovych was overthrown. Poroshenko stepped into the void, but he hadn't really been like voted to become president. And the Poroshenko regime was transitional from that time period, but there was a lot of like bribery and grift going on. And this takes us into 2014-15 when Donetsk and Luhansk declared their secession and tried to rejoin Russia, and Russia seizes the Crimea because they're in this like really difficult stage where they just got rid of their pro-Russian puppet president, and after a prolonged series of violent demonstrations and protests, they're coming back from the brink of civil war, and Russia has an interest in trying to destabilize this democratic movement in Ukraine and also possibly reinstall its former client, Yanukovych, back into power. The kickoff to that was the president before Yanukovych was a woman named Yulia Tymoshenko. She was chased from power by Yanukovych and his associates under somewhat questionable charges of corruption. I'm not really going to weigh into that, but it was an undemocratic seizure of power by a Russian puppet. Ukrainians were like kind of okay with it because Tymoshenko was not like her hands weren't exactly clean, but when it became clear that Yanukovych was trying to consolidate power for himself on a line similar to their neighbor to the north, Belarus, which is ruled over by what a dude is often referred to as like Europe's last dictator, more kind of mold along the lines of Putin. Ukrainian people like, we don't want to go down that route again. We want to have our freedom, and they rebelled against it, but it destabilized the country. And so when Crimea was annexed by Russia in 2014, there really wasn't anything Ukraine could have done about that. And then there wasn't really much they could do about the secession of Luhansk and Donetsk. But the reason they fought for those regions as opposed to Crimea was geographically and strategically speaking, they could fight for those regions. They couldn't really fight for Crimea because Crimea is attached to Ukraine by a very thin strip of land. It's a peninsula. And the Russians had naval control of the Black Sea, which is where the Crimean Peninsula is located, and could really move about Crimea at will, whereas the Ukrainians would be incredibly hard-pressed to try to reinforce their position in Crimea. And if they did fight, like, it would be very easy for Russia to just cut off the isthmus that connects Crimea to Ukraine and effectively starve out the Ukrainian defenders.
We'd be looking at another Mariupol situation, pretty much.
Right.
And for those that don't understand what Mariupol is, it was, for lack of a better way to put it, it was kind of the Alamo of Ukraine. Yeah. It was on the southeastern side of Ukraine, which lasted, I think they lasted like 3-4 months there or something like that. 3 months.
Yeah, Mariupol was only declared secured by the Russian government like 2-3 weeks ago. So, and it had been one of the first cities that was attacked.
And it was encircled and bombarded relentlessly.
Yeah. But yeah, no, likening that to the Alamo is great. I would say it's more analogous to the Danzig situation that prompted the Nazi invasion of Poland. Because what the Russians were trying to do with seizing Mariupol is basically form a land corridor between Donetsk and Luhansk and their holdings in Crimea. And also Mariupol is a major port city too. So if they can seize that and deprive Ukraine of that, like moving forward post-war, that puts a massive economic burden on Ukraine and would obligate them to be more economically tied to Russia, and give the Russians significant leverage over Ukraine's ability to export. And actually, I'll use that as a launching point for next thing I want to talk about, which is the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, why it's both so close, but also so
different,
contentious, and why there's a lot of animus there. So, and why Putin and his advisors generally disregard Ukraine's right to existence and wanted the whole thing back. Why there was this idea amongst many foreign observers that the stated goals of Russia about just protecting Russians in Ukraine and liberating Donetsk and Luhansk is a little bit short of the overall actual intention, which is a full-on seizure of Ukraine itself. And that is that Ukraine is one of the largest grain producers in the world. Now, the top three are us, Russia, and Ukraine. Two of them are at war with each other, which is why we're kind of looking at global food shortages going into the summer as this war draws on. And this also ties into World War II and the outbreak of that. A couple million ethnic Germans living in Ukraine. Germany wanted to expand into Ukraine to liberate those Germans and bring them into the greater German fold. The term that Nazis used was the Greater Reich. But they also wanted access to the fertile farm and grain fields of Ukraine, because all those extra millions of ethnic Germans that the Nazis were bringing into Greater Germany need to be fed. And it's much the same even still. I'm going off on a tangent there, so I'm going to reel it back in. Ukraine was the breadbasket of Tsarist Russia. That's where most of the grain came from. And the Soviets could not allow Ukraine to be independent, because at the outbreak of the Russian Revolution, and then the subsequent outbreak of the October Revolution that overthrew the provisional government that replaced the Tsars, and the beginning of the Russian Civil War, across all of the former Tsarist Empire, there are wars breaking out as the different pieces of the Tsarist regime want to become independent. But there's also moves within those areas to reform the Tsarist regime. The Russian Civil War is a fascinating panoply of different movements butting heads against one another. It's many of whom really should have just joined forces and fought against one or the other of the other groups that were trying to exterminate them, and they didn't. They got ripped apart. That's largely how the Bolsheviks came to power. But like, there's wars. Poland fights a civil war against Tsarist officials that want to defeat all the independence movements. Bolsheviks trying to seize power for communists in Poland, but also Poles who wanted to be independent. The independence Poles wound up winning out, but as part of the Russian Civil War, they're also fighting Poland crosses over everywhere. Ukraine's the same. And in Ukraine actually, during the height of the Russian Civil War, is where a lot of the Tsarist forces coagulated and formed up. And most of the fighting to wipe out the Tsarist or white forces occurred in that part of Russia. But then once the Tsarist forces were defeated, there's a 2-year stint where Ukrainians themselves wanted independence from, they wanted independence. They didn't want to be a part of a country that didn't take their rights into consideration. That was suppressed. And a little bit later on in the 1920s, without trying to get too deep into Russia, Soviet communist Bolshevik history, because it's
very complicated.
Sorry?
It's very complicated in terms of how all that works out too. The thing is, like, Russia, it's so large and diverse, and it's different ethnicities and people that live there, that I don't know where else in the world you could really describe it. Like, I'm not going to try to, in fears of trying not to offend people. But in terms of how diverse and the different factions there are, it's not just one and two. It's, you have all these different peoples that live very similar but different lives. And that's kind of what led to the Civil War, because they're trying to all, for one, be in power, because whoever was in power was able to control this ginormous country that has all this power. But as you were saying,
yeah. So what wound up happening later on in the 1920s, there was a spasm of pro-Bolshevik but anti-Soviet protests that briefly broke out into armed conflict, and the Soviet government quickly put it down. Massive loss of life for the people that were blamed for it. But this was in Ukraine. And a couple of years later, going in 1930, not necessarily related to the peasant revolt, because basically what happened with long and short of the revolt was that the peasants of Ukraine were getting fed up that the Soviet government kind of was treating them much like the Tsars had. And they had fought on the side of the Bolsheviks in the revolution and the Civil War because the Bolsheviks promised to treat them different. That didn't happen. And they were pretty pissed about it and tried to go to the Soviet government. Soviet government ignored them. So then they dug out caches of weapons that they buried, rebelled. But, not much you can do when your weapons consist of clubs, sights, and a handful of old bolt-action rifles against a military that's got airplanes and tanks, and also no qualms about gunning down tens of thousands of people. So,
exactly.
But in the 30s, the Soviet government decided that they wanted to force industrialization and collectivize agriculture so that all parts of the Soviet sphere would be fed, and they could concentrate on rapidly modernizing Soviet infrastructure. And they decided to do this by forcing farmers in Ukraine to do nothing but farm grain. And then the Soviet government came and took all that grain and moved it around the Soviet Union. So parts of the Soviet Union that were facing food shortages all of a sudden got lots of grain. Like, it was all well and good. Ukraine faced a catastrophic famine known as the Holodomor. And conservative estimates put the death toll at 1 million, but realistically it was closer to like between 3 to 5. It's, unlike the Holocaust, hard to keep numbers, because the Holocaust, the Germans had recorded lists of like, oh, on this date we liquidated 45,000 individuals that are subhuman. So we know, like, okay, that's how we have such a good estimate for how many people died from the Holocaust. Holodomor was like, they were dying of starvation. The Soviet government didn't care to feed them and did not allow farmers to retain any of their grain. And part of that was for punishment for the peasant rebellion from just a couple years previously. But also part of it stemmed from this the Marxist idea that like no one should have private property because all property is property of the state. And if the state needs your grain, like the state takes your grain. They'll provide for you in other ways, except the Soviet government didn't provide for the Ukrainians. And millions of them starved to death. Like I said, it's broad, wide range. Some estimates go as high as 10 million. I think that number's a little too high. So for the sake of simplicity, let's say 3 million starved to death in the Holodomor. On top of that, there's purges going on in Russia. The NKVD are killing tens of thousands of people for different reasons. And that also spills over into the death toll for the Holodomor. It's kind of hard to tell. Like when the NKVD rolls into a town and shoots a bunch of people, is that part of the process of the forced collectivization of agriculture, or is that just the NKVD doing their brutal secret police stuff that they did for decades until Stalin's death? Anyways, I digress.
Yeah.
So, Ukraine. Sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah. So keep going with Ukraine. I want to tie everything in after.
So in Ukraine, the Holodomor has almost as significant a cultural hold on their memory as the Holocaust does in Israel, because it's much the same as far as the Ukrainians are concerned. Because while they weren't being gassed and liquidated in on an industrial scale, the fact of the matter is all the food that they produced was ripped out of their country and put elsewhere, and they weren't giving anything, and they were left to starve to death. And while in a way it was kind of democratic because the Soviet government didn't draw a distinction between Russian Ukrainians and Ukrainian Ukrainians, like everybody starved. The fact that it happened in the region of the Ukraine, it's viewed as like a big joint suffering. Russian Ukrainians now kind of contextualize that as part of the greater suffering of the Stalinist era and the Soviets in general, that like they don't draw a distinction. But Ukrainian Ukrainians view it as the Russians tried to wipe us out. And that's why they kind of have this divide. But on the same token, Ukraine was for centuries a part of Russia and not really viewed as being separate up until 1991. So even though Ukrainian, like they're a different ethnic group, but up until 1991, like they were also Russian. They were Soviet, they were Russian, they were Tsarist citizens as well. And so there's this shared brotherhood, but also with this really contentious blot in the middle. I guess it's a crass analogy, but the best way I could phrase it is like Ukraine's the younger brother of Russia, and they have a lot of brotherly love for one another. But Russia, the older brother, kind of would generally wail and beat the crap out of the younger, weaker, easier to pound brother for years, and it's like kind of a
cycle
sort of relationship. They love each other, but also the younger, weaker sibling
has it
brutally victimized many times over, and has some justified fear and hatred of its older sibling.
Okay, so yeah, bringing that all in, there's a lot of information here that we've been over.
Yeah, sorry.
No, don't be sorry. I think it's very interesting, and I don't think many people understand the history, which is like, if you don't understand the history, you don't really understand anything about the entire conflict. And I think it just goes to show that, for one, trying to learn history so that we don't repeat ourselves, which is kind of what we're seeing right now, is a repeat of history, much like World War II. It's scary when you look at all the similarities through looking into the causes of each.
Even the Russian justification for its special military operation is, I mean, you could swap the mouthpieces between Putin and Hitler, and it's functionally the same argument.
Yeah. It's terrible, for one. It's awful. And I've done a bit of digging into the conflict and seeing what's happened, and it's just terrible. But besides the point, I think what we're trying to say here, and we're going to have to restart again, but I'll cut this part out, and we're going to go back in. Okay. So what I'm trying to say here is that I think there's a lot. History is very dense, and I think for a lot of people, being a history teacher, you might be able to help me out with this, we need to find a way to get people to, because I think it is very interesting, but you got to lend yourself to it, because we're seeing a repeat of history now, and to prevent that, we need to know what's happened in the past. That's why if you listened to certain people that know the history, they kind of saw this coming, as the way that Putin was talking for the past 3 years. And not to mention beforehand when they took Crimea and had the secession of the Donetsk region. But for people listening, I would say go, if you find this interesting, go and try and read. And it's very hard to read. It's not easy. But it's very interesting to kind of see the life of Solzhenitsyn. Read the Gulag Archipelago. Go and just look at videos of the history of World War II, or even if you can find, I think it's more available to see stuff from World War II than it is to see stuff from what we've talked about with the different civil wars and conflicts in Russia.
Yeah.
But just go try and read up, and not just with that, because that's going on, but with American history. I mean, we just had Juneteenth happen, the holiday, and a lot of people don't understand what that's all about. And read up on that. Read up on all the history you can, just so that we can understand each other better and like prevent terrible things from happening again, honestly.
Yeah. One last thing I want to add on to that. I know we're running on time here, so I'm going to keep it short. But you suggested read Gulag Archipelago. 2 other books I would recommend. They're relatively short, concise, and offer a great insight into like Russia, Ukraine, the shared history that they have. Jeffrey Warrow's A Mad Catastrophe, which is about the outbreak of World War I, and Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, which is about the conflict between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, but also just the process of mass death that plays out in Central and Eastern Europe between those 2 powers, but also under Soviet leadership, like the Holodomor that I was talking about. They're a little less dense than Alexander Solzhenitsyn. They're more recently published, and they kind of offer a good overview of all that stuff.
Okay. Well, I want to say a few more things. So we were saying we're just back. The meeting ended. It was a whole thing, but we're back. And so what we're really trying to say is that there's a lot of history, and a lot of it's very complex. But what we should try and do is to understand people and help people out, because we're all human.
Mm-hmm.
We don't like committing atrocities to each other. At least I don't. But I can't speak for everyone. I think we really just need to understand each other more. But to do that and to prevent history from repeating itself, we really need to become informed, which, I mean, the news doesn't really help with nowadays. But yeah, like I worked in the news when all this stuff started. I worked in a news place, and it was terrifying to say the least when Ukraine got invaded. Yeah, I was at work when it was happening. It was, yeah, I remember everything that happened. But anyways, yeah, if you can, just take even just 5 pages at a time, maybe just try and read up on this stuff, or even watch a 10-minute video. Like, what are some ways that you think we could make as a history teacher, how do you think we can make history more accessible to people, or get people interested in even just certain subjects, trying to just pick a subject to like learn about?
Yeah, well, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? Because, like, as a teacher, that's what I'm always constantly trying to figure out what to do. The fact of the matter is, going over stuff in school, like right off the bat, you're just going to have people that, because they're being taught it, forced to learn it, don't have an interest. Like it just goes in one ear, out the other. I'm the same way with math. Like I hated math, didn't want to do that. I could not tell you like, give me a quadratic equation, ask me to solve it. I'm screwed.
Yeah.
My life is on the line. I'm just gonna have to have you shoot me. So like for people that didn't really have an interest in that subject to begin with, when the first point to really learn about stuff is in school. That's why we have education. But a lot of that stuff is not really going to be super appealing to a lot of people because they have to learn it. And it's important for them to learn it. Like it's important I learned what a quadratic equation is, although I didn't hold on to that information. But that'll turn a lot of people off right off the bat. When people have an interest in learning about the stuff like outside of school, there's so much material to access. Big part of the trouble is finding out what is good material, and for that, really the only way to get around it is just consume as much as you can from different sources, because the fact of the matter is about history that it's wide ranging and expansive, and there's no truly unbiased way of looking at it, because everything will just by the course of events will naturally have a spin put on it. And just purely looking at raw information without contextualizing it causes you to miss why stuff happened and how to avoid it in the future. And it's also very boring because like if I'm going to read a history of the Second World War with no bias that just goes by pure information, okay, Germany invades Poland September 1st, 1939. France declared war 3 days later. France is invaded by Germany in May and collapses in June of 1940. That's it. Like it's just a chronicle. There's no information there that makes it interesting. But it's impossible to provide more information without putting some spin of a bias on it, right?
That's what makes it human, though.
Right. So, don't just read about it, but don't just read like one source. Like, oh, okay, well, I read just Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, and so now I know everything there is to know about the killings and the mass death in Ukraine that was caused by both the Nazis and the Russians, and the mass death caused by the Nazis against the Russians, which is part of what kickstarts this whole Russian fear cycle of, oh, we need to go denazify Ukraine, and why that's like their go-to example. And because I read this one book by this one guy, now I know everything. I mean, I'm not trying to throw Timothy Snyder the book on the bus. I think it's one of the best books out there that goes over the stuff, so I strongly recommend it. But I'm saying don't just read that and then walk away from it thinking, okay, well, now I know stuff. Because Snyder definitely has a bit of a bias. Everybody writer does. He just does a much better job at not bringing it to the fore and trying to deliver information to you without trying to lecture you about, oh, well, this is why these people are evil, blah, blah, blah. He really tries to get at the root of like why he tries to unveil the mechanics of this mass death, why it happened, as kind of a way to warn us to not do it in the future. But it also comes down to the individual that's absorbing this information and how they choose to contextualize and absorb it. Because one could read Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands and come away from it like, oh my God, this is awful. We can't allow this to happen again. Another person could come away from reading it thinking, well, okay, that just gave me a blueprint if ever I want to try to do this on my own. Because he explained the mechanics of how to seize political power and then use the instruments of the state against its own population to further that state's preservation of its own life, while also snuffing out lives of its citizens as part of its security measures.
Jesus.
So
it could be, it's taken like art pretty much. It's how you interpret it.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
But that's what I'm saying. Like, expand your information base. So, like, read Bloodlands to understand how, like, those regimes came into power. You have to understand the global events that led into them. So, read Jeffrey Waro's book. Read Gulag Archipelago. all
All
those stuff will
different
have bits of
facets.
information. Then you can kind of figure it out for yourself because what they'll have overlapping data, and that
Hmm.
helps let you know that what the real kind of story is. The truth always lies in between, as they say.
Right, and that it's funny because that goes into media literacy, and that's what I went to school for was communications, and that's a massive part of why the news is taken as fake news now, and why you have to vet everything you look at pretty much when it comes to just looking at everyday news.
Mhm.
Um, but I'm gonna take from that and say that for one, that's very important, media literacy. Um, whether it's reading in history or reading the news. But what we can also take is like there's different approaches in terms of consuming as much as you can. But there's also different approaches when we talk about how people understand because you don't even just have to read. Um, we can take it to the idea that there's 3 to 4 ways to educate people. One is through
Mhm.
conversation like this, where we have an open, not so much debate this time around, but it was more just speaking and talking literally about it, almost like a teacher or a professor.
Mhm.
Another avenue would be in story. Um, that's kind of the approach that the Gulag Archipelago takes because he tries to tell it's a true story based on his events in life, but it's a fictional
Right.
character. You do this through movies, fictional stories, and books, so on and so forth. Music. You try and humanize it though. And the third way is through documentary, and the fourth way is through straight up reading.
Mhm.
But that could also be under story, depending on how you. But documentary is pretty much putting it in a film that isn't fictional. So go those different avenues. See which one's best for you.
I,
Find what
I would say
interests
mix
you.
match them all. Like diversify your education the same way you diversify an investment portfolio. Have your hands in a little bit of everything and absorb information that way. Because like storytelling's great, but it's also very easy to manipulate and twist that. Um, and you know, every every culture, every society, civilization, person does it. Storytelling is probably the least effective way to communicate reliable information, but the most effective way to communicate interesting information. Um, but then it can all the message or the facts you're trying to get across can oftentimes be lost under just waves of like metaphor and imagery and simile.
Emotion.
Yeah, which can make it difficult to kind of pick that stuff out.
Exactly. And
That's
that
a good one.
that's exactly why it's important to also read and look at documentary and like you said diversify your portfolio. I think it's the storytelling aspect humanizes it. The
Oh,
other
for sure.
avenues solidify the facts.
Right. And storytelling, like for say Second World War, storytelling is a great way to get people interested in it. Because I know of a bunch of students that I've worked with who like, oh my God, they're bored to tears listening about this crap in class, but they play Call of Duty World War II, and they have fun with it. And they're like, oh man, I want to know more about like that mission where I landed on the beach and had to take out that bunker. Like, I want to know more about that. So that method of storytelling gets them interested more. They watch Saving Private Ryan, which is a complete fiction, and they're just astonished by the beach scene or the
Mm-hmm.
fighting at the end of the movie, where like Matt Damon's character and Tom Hanks like make their little Alamo stand at that French city. Wow, I want to know more about that, and that in turn inspires them to like do their research project, focus on that stuff or something like that. And on their own, it fuels them learning about other stuff. But to, play, if you play Call of Duty World War II and walk away from it thinking, oh, well, like, that's fact.
It is not.
No. That game does not go into the nuances of why the conflict happened or the breadth of it. And, there's some stuff in that game that is like just clearly fictitious and,
Not to
liberties
mention,
that the game designers took to make it way more fun and entertaining.
yeah. So maybe the approach is when you go into a subject, if you can find like a film, and you start off by watching a movie about it to pique the interest of your students. And I'm not a teacher, so I don't know. But this is from what we just talked about right there. This is kind of what I'm getting from that, and it's maybe watch a movie that pertains to this, like, or even like if you want to read up on sports history or something like that, maybe you watch Remember the Titans, and that brings you to stuff in America that was going on in the 70s, 60s, 70s. And you go on and you watch a documentary after, or you read a book about that season or something.
Mm-hmm.
You just pique people's interest with the story, humanize the story, so they're not just like, oh, these are people that are dead. Why do I care? Maybe that's a silver bullet. Who knows? I'm not a teacher, but
no, it's. I mean, like with my lessons, devoting time to watch a movie that takes a little too long because you only have a limited number of class days. We've got to get through material.
That's true.
So I'll use movies as like a reward for something. If we're ahead of schedule, or if like everyone's been turning stuff in on time. But what I do try to do is sprinkle through my lessons video clips that illustrate stuff I'm talking about. So rather than watching like a whole movie, we'll watch like a 2 to 5 minute chunk of it. If it illustrates something specific, like, okay, for instance, this year when we were going over the American Civil War, I watched a few clips from stuff like Cold Mountain, Gettysburg, and Glory that all touched on different aspects of the conflict. And, we did, like, if I wanted to watch the whole movie Gettysburg, that's a 4.5 hour movie. That's like 3 class periods just gone.
Yeah, exactly.
About one battle.
Huh.
In the event, we spent probably 2 weeks going over the Civil War, so a bunch of class time. But like, if that would have added another week or 2 weeks worth of classes onto that just to cover one movie about one battle. So sometimes doing that is not
lucrative,
super useful, but yeah, like I said, I'll do that as a reward.
Okay. Now, I wonder if it would be more effective rather than going over content multiple times if, as you progress through school, possibly lending a whole school year to 30 years of U.S. history or 30 years of world history or something. I mean, when you're talking about world history, it gets very, very dense and diverse, but...
It is. Well, and that's part of the problem with learning about it in school, is we have a very limited time frame to talk about a massive amount of topics and across a broad array of time and space. The problem with that is you can't really get into the minutiae and the details that are really fascinating, captivating. You can really only do kind of like a general overview. Because there are people that have spent their entire careers, multiple decades, conducting deep research about one aspect of the Battle of Gettysburg, right? And they'll write like magazine articles and books about that one aspect, and they get really into the nitty gritty. It's fascinating to read about that stuff and understand like just how logistics helped the Union Army while the Confederacy suffered as a result of that. Their poorer logistics, and that's important to know to understand how the war unfolds. But I'm not going to go into that when I'm talking about it in class. Like, I'll touch on it very, very briefly, but I'm not going to go into the details. I'm not going to go about how like the Quartermaster General of the United States did a fantastic job at organizing ammunition production, but also maybe sort of shot himself in the foot when he refused to use new technologies like magazine-fed repeating rifles, which were available at the outbreak of the war, and by relying on single-shot muzzle-loading muskets, possibly may have prolonged it. That's not the kind of detail that like my students need to learn about. It's fascinating and interesting stuff, but overall, what we have to go over is like why the war happened, how long it lasted, some of the major battles. You know, if you're going to learn, when you learn about the Civil War in class, you have to learn about like Battle of Gettysburg, Battle of, well, not really a battle, but like the siege of, God damn it, now I'm drawing a blank on the name, Fort Sumter, and, you know, Appomattox when the war ends with the Confederacy surrender. Like, no one really needs to learn about the Seventh Battle of Winchester, Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
Is that over the course of the war, that city changed hands
Multiple times.
Like, reading about the battle's fascinating.
Who's
Has no real bearing on the overall larger narrative. And in addition to the Civil War, like we also have to cover, you know, America's evolving global power, evolution as a global power in the late 19th, early 20th century. Got to cover like World War II, civil rights movement, Cold War, colonization of America by Europeans before that. Like all that stuff has to be covered within a year.
Yeah, there's just not enough time for all that.
And it's like the same thing, you know, with World War II. They'll cover it a little bit in world history. We'll cover it a little bit in U.S. history. Some of the same material will be gone over, but also like other stuff. You know, you don't really learn about the Holocaust in U.S. history because that isn't really it'll be mentioned, but it's not like a big part of America's involvement in World War II because that was perpetrated by the Nazis against mostly Europeans. The U.S. involvement basically comes down to we don't believe it's a thing. Oh shit, we just liberated the concentration camps, found out it very much is a thing, and now we have to take care of the survivors and punish the people responsible for it. And like that's it. The actual mechanics, that's world history stuff because it occurred on the world stage, not in the U.S.
Wow.
So
you just have there's too much to cover.
There's too much to cover, and the problem is like I hear all the time people talk about, you know, oh man, why didn't we learn about this in school? Like they should go over it. Well, yes, we should. Problem is, it's very like we have to tell a story, but we can't get too bogged down in the details, or else we never get to the end of the story.
And that's almost what makes people view history, at least in grade school, as boring because you don't get to humanize it because there's too much to cover to even get to that level.
I mean, it also doesn't help that to do that oftentimes take simplistic shortcuts because the fact of the matter is when you do get into details, it can be aggravating, frustrating, traumatizing, and in some cases just downright unbelievable for a lot of people. So we tend to try to streamline the narrative. On top of that, sometimes we oversimplify things a little bit too much. And like we have a responsibility to try to walk that back. But at the end of the day, it's just easier to say that, like, you know, since we both came up in Massachusetts, it's just easier to say that, like, the first Thanksgiving began because the Pilgrims got along well with the Native Americans. And then at some point, you know, relationships degraded and we didn't get along so well with Indians. It's just easier to take that route than to dive into the different political machinations of the different English colonial groups in Massachusetts that didn't see eye to eye, and how conflict between them kind of spilled over into conflict between Native Americans, while the conflict between, you know, different Native American groups in New England led to some groups getting closer to the Europeans and others getting into armed conflict with them because it's just a big mess, right?
Yeah.
So it's just easy to say, hey, all the British people came over, they're the Pilgrims. Native Americans, like, they got along at first, and we had Thanksgiving. Anyways, we'll fast forward now to the Revolution rather than trying to delve into like that 100-year period of trying to establish a European presence in New England. Anyways, I digress. I went off on a tangent there.
No, it's fine. Like that's a thing that like kind of proves like we could sit here and literally talk all day about history. We've been here for a long time. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to everything that's gone on, and I think it's hard. History is one of the subjects, much like math, that is very hard to get people into. And so, but it's so important, man. It is just so important that we need to take lessons from the past, not just to prevent them from happening, but just to be able to understand each other better and humanize each other. Like I just rely heavily on this message of we need to humanize each other, because matter of fact is like nowadays we just don't. Like so much of it is you're just either just another statistic, or I'm not going to understand you because you've had experiences that I could never have experienced. You could say that about anyone.
Right.
But if you really break yourself down to it, you can at least try to understand them. And the more you can humanize others, the more we can come to agreements where we might not get exactly our way, but we can work towards making a better place for everyone. I had Goylan Williams come on, and we talked about why am I blanking on the term? It's massive. Critical race theory. We talked about that and how if we were to humanize each other rather than just dismiss this thing that we don't even understand,
right,
we could make things better for each other. Or if we went and talked about the Russia conflict in Ukraine, if we went and understood the implications that it could have in the future, very near future, and allocated resources or figured out a way to end that conflict and stop this so seeming, I can't really say much to it, but stop this whole imagining, I guess, of the Soviet Union, for lack of a better way to put it, in my mind. The atrocities that were committed during the Soviet Union, not to mention that happened in other countries like the U.S., we committed atrocities too, like you were mentioning, with the British, like the settlers and the Native Americans. Massive atrocities were committed there. But if we can learn from our ancestors and from the people before us the mistakes that they made to bring people to understand and help and make a better world, we need to try and do that. And we got to start with the first step, and that's just learning about it.
Exactly.
Yeah. So thank you for what you do. Not to mention you're a track coach. We didn't really get into that, but that's also a huge thing that teaches the youth to work hard and follow their dreams, not just in athletic things, but in life in general. Like I pulled so much from doing track and doing football. It made me who I am today. So yeah, I think teachers and coaches should get more thanks. But yeah, I think we covered a lot here, and I want to thank you for coming on. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to say before we hop off here, or...
No, I mean, like you said, we covered a lot of stuff today. Hopefully it wasn't too dense and involved. I know I went off on a couple tangents. I tend to do that sometimes when I'm talking about the stuff, like I'm going down this path, and then all of a sudden my brain's like, oh wait, I have to talk about this other thing that's related to it. That's also basically what history is, and it's sometimes hard to keep track of the end goal that you're working towards when there's a lot of other stuff out there that spans off that. So, but I think it's pretty important to do stuff like this as well. You said it's that teachers play an important role, but people doing what you're doing also play a pretty important role as well, because this puts information out there for people to listen to that they might just kind of shut off for when they're sitting in a classroom. Because, loads of people will just put on podcasts while they're doing dishes, making dinner and stuff like that. And even if they're not really locked in on it, they're still absorbing that information.
Yeah.
It's a form of storytelling. Like you said, it's one of the most important methods of communication that we've got.
Well, I appreciate that.
Doing this, and thank you for putting this together and for arranging a time for us to finally actually do it.
Yeah. I've been looking forward to this for too long. I mean, there's so many subjects that I'd love to cover. We'll have to have you come on again.
For sure.
But yeah, thank you, man. I appreciate it. And yeah, have a good day, everyone. Take care. I hope you found this interesting, and I hope you think now maybe you want to read up on some history and learn some stuff about the past. So with that being said, everyone have a good day and take care. Thanks, Will.
Take care.